In the heart of Eastern Europe, where winter mornings arrive with the sharp bite of danger and the distant echo of gunfire, there lived a woman whose quiet demeanor masked one of the most lethal skills known to warfare. Her neighbors saw her as just another refugee tending to her small garden, speaking softly to her children, never raising her voice above a whisper. The occupying forces dismissed her entirely, a mistake that would cost them dearly. What they didn't know was that before the war scattered her family and destroyed her home, she had been one of the most feared snipers in her nation's military. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And when the time came to protect what remained of her community, her rifle would speak the words her voice had kept hidden. This is the true story of how underestimating a quiet woman became an enemy's final mistake. Katerina Volkov had learned long ago that survival often depended on becoming invisible. In the small village of Brenfield, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, she moved through her days like a shadow cast by someone else's light. The other refugees who had fled to this remote corner of the country knew her as the woman who grew the best vegetables despite the poor soil, who could mend any torn clothing with stitches so fine they seemed to disappear, and who never spoke unless spoken to first. The morning of March 15th began like any other. Katerina woke before dawn, as was her habit, and stepped quietly through the small cottage she shared with her 8-year-old daughter Anna and elderly neighbor Mrs. Best, Petrova. The wooden floors, warped with age and moisture, had learned to keep her secrets, barely creaking under her careful footsteps. She moved to the kitchen window and pulled back the thin curtain, her pale blue eyes scanning the tree line that bordered their property. Everything appeared normal. The early morning mist hung low over the fields, and the forest beyond remained still and silent. But Katerina's trained instincts, honed through years of military service before the war had turned her world upside down, picked up on something others would miss. The birds weren't singing their usual dawn chorus. That absence of sound, to her experienced ear, was as loud as a scream. She had been Sergeant Major Katerina Volkov once, one of only 12 women accepted into her country's elite sniper program. For 6 years she had served with distinction, earning commendations for her exceptional marksmanship and her ability to remain undetected in hostile territory for days at a time. Her record showed 89 confirmed eliminations, each one an enemy combatant who would never again threaten her people. But that was before the occupation, before her husband Pavel disappeared during the initial invasion, before she and Anna had fled their home in the capital with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small bag of precious belongings. The bag, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the cottage's bedroom, contained items that might seem ordinary to anyone who discovered them. A few photographs, some jewelry that had belonged to her mother, and a leather-bound journal filled with what appeared to be gardening notes. But Katerina knew that buried within those innocent-looking pages were detailed observations about the occupying forces, their patrol routes, their numbers, their equipment, and their vulnerabilities. She had been watching and recording for months, her military training making it impossible for her to remain truly passive in the face of the enemy's presence. The occupying army had established a command post in the neighboring town of Millbrook, just 8 kilometers away. From there, they controlled the movement of all civilians in the region, rationing food and fuel, conducting random searches, and maintaining what they called peace and security through intimidation and force. 3 times a week, patrols would sweep through Brenfield and the surrounding farms, searching for weapons, contraband, or signs of resistance activity. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Steinmann commanded the Millbrook garrison with the efficiency and ruthlessness that had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. He was a man who believed that fear was the most effective tool for maintaining order among civilian populations. His soldiers had been instructed to show no mercy to anyone suspected of harboring resistance fighters or weapons. Houses were searched thoroughly, personal belongings were confiscated without explanation, and anyone who showed the slightest defiance was taken away for questioning at the command post. Steinmann had personally conducted several of these interrogations, using methods that went far beyond what international law permitted. He justified these actions as necessary measures in wartime, believing that harsh treatment of a few would prevent larger uprising among the many. His reputation for cruelty had spread throughout the region, and most civilians went to great lengths to avoid drawing his attention. But Steinmann had made one critical error in his assessment of the local population. He had dismissed the refugees, particularly the women, as broken people who posed no threat to his operations. He saw them as defeated individuals who had already lost everything and lacked both the will and the means to resist his forces. This assumption had shaped his security protocols and influenced how his soldiers conducted their patrols. Katerina understood this psychology well. She had studied enemy behavior patterns during her military service, learning how overconfidence could create exploitable weaknesses. She deliberately cultivated the image of a traumatized refugee, speaking in quiet, hesitant tones when forced to interact with the soldiers, keeping her eyes downcast, and presenting herself as someone completely broken by the war. It was a performance that required considerable skill, as every instinct in her body screamed at her to fight back when she witnessed the brutality inflicted on her neighbors. The previous week she had watched from her kitchen window as soldiers dragged away Tom Brennan, a local farmer who had supposedly made disparaging comments about the occupation. Tom was a gentle man in his 60s who had never shown any signs of resistance activity. His only crime had been expressing frustration about the reduced food rations during a conversation with his neighbor. Someone had reported his words to the authorities, and within hours, soldiers had arrived at his farm. Katerina had seen Tom's wife, Sarah, collapse in tears as they forced him into the back of a military truck. She had wanted desperately to intervene, to use the skills she possessed to protect an innocent man from an unjust fate. But she also knew that revealing her true capabilities at that moment would have accomplished nothing except getting herself and Anna killed or captured. The strategic part of her mind, trained to think in terms of larger objectives rather than immediate emotions, recognized that patience and careful planning would serve her people better than impulsive action. As she continued her morning routine, preparing a simple breakfast of porridge and dried fruit for Anna and Mrs. Petrova, Katerina allowed herself to think about Pavel. She had no way of knowing whether her husband was still alive, whether he had been captured, killed, or had managed to escape to continue fighting with the resistance. The uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her current situation, but she had learned to compartmentalize her personal grief in order to focus on protecting what remained of her family. Anna stirred in the bed they shared, opening her dark eyes and offering her mother a sleepy smile. The child had adapted remarkably well to their circumstances, showing a resilience that both amazed and concerned Katerina. Anna had learned to be quiet when soldiers were near, to never mention her father or their previous life, and to treat their refugee status as a kind of game they were playing. But Katerina could see the toll this constant vigilance was taking on her daughter, the way she sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds, the nightmares that occasionally woke her in the middle of the night. "Good morning, little bird," Katerina whispered, using the pet name Pavel had always used for their daughter. Anna giggled softly and scrambled out of bed, careful not to wake Mrs. Assistance Petrova, who suffered from arthritis and needed all the rest she could get. As they ate breakfast together, Katerina found herself studying Anna's face, seeing so much of Pavel in the child's features. Anna had inherited her father's dark hair and expressive eyes, but she had her mother's quiet nature and observational skills. The child had an uncanny ability to sense when danger was approaching, often alerting Katerina to the presence of patrols before they became visible. Mama," Anna said quietly, stirring her porridge with a wooden spoon carved by Mrs. Petrova's late husband. "The bad men are coming today, aren't they?" Katerina felt her breath catch. She had been so careful not to communicate her concerns to Anna, wanting to preserve whatever innocence remained to the child. But Anna's intuition had proven remarkably accurate throughout their time in Brenfield. "What makes you think that, little bird?" Anna shrugged, a gesture that seemed too mature for her 8 years. "The birds are different today." And Mrs. Chen next door closed all her shutters even though it's not raining. Katerina realized that her daughter was developing the same survival instincts that had kept them alive thus far. It was both reassuring and heartbreaking to see such awareness in someone so young. She reached across the small table and touched Anna's hand gently. "If they do come, you know what to do." Anna nodded seriously. "Hide in the root cellar until you come get me. Don't make any noise. Don't come out no matter what I hear." The root cellar had been Mrs. Petrova's idea. The elderly woman had survived 2 previous occupations during her long life and understood the importance of having secure hiding places. Together they had carefully concealed a small space beneath the cottage's floorboards, accessible through a hidden panel in the kitchen. The space was barely large enough for Anna to lie down, but it was completely invisible to anyone searching the house. Mrs. Petrova emerged from the bedroom, moving slowly but with determination. Despite her age and physical limitations, she had become an invaluable part of their small household. Her knowledge of local conditions, her network of relationships with longtime residents, and her experience with surviving difficult times had helped them navigate the challenges of life under occupation. "They're planning something different today," Mrs. Petrova said without preamble. Accepting the cup of weak tea Katerina offered her, Mrs. Chen told me yesterday that her nephew heard soldiers talking about a major operation. "They're looking for someone specific." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. At their time in Brentfield, the military patrols had been routine security sweeps, unpleasant but predictable. If the soldiers were conducting a targeted search, it meant someone had provided them with specific information about resistance activity in the area. "Do we know who they're looking for?" Mrs. Petrova shook her gray head. "No details, but they've been asking questions about newcomers, people who arrived in the last year. They're particularly interested in anyone with military experience." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Katerina had been so careful to hide her background, presenting herself as nothing more than a displaced civilian. She had never mentioned her military service to anyone in Brentfield, had never displayed any knowledge or skills that might betray her true identity. But she knew that determined investigators could eventually piece together information from multiple sources. She thought about the leather journal hidden beneath the floorboards, filled with detailed observations about enemy positions and capabilities. If the soldiers found that journal during a search, it would be impossible to explain away as innocent gardening notes the level of detail, the military terminology carefully encoded within seemingly innocent observations about soil conditions and plant growth, would immediately reveal her true nature. "Anna, I need you to go visit Mrs. Martinez this morning," Katerina said, referring to a neighbor who lived on the other side of the village. "Help her with her washing and stay there until I come get you." Anna's eyes widened with understanding. She had learned to read the subtle signs in her mother's voice, the tiny changes in tone that indicated when a situation was becoming dangerous. Without argument or question, she finished her porridge and began gathering her few belongings. As Anna prepared to leave, Katerina made her own preparations. She retrieved the journal from its hiding place and spent several minutes memorizing the most critical information it contained. Then she carefully tore out several pages and burned them in the kitchen fireplace, ensuring that the most damaging evidence of her surveillance activities was destroyed. The remaining pages, filled with more innocent observations, she returned to the journal and placed back in its hiding spot. She also retrieved another item from the concealed compartment beneath the floorboards. Wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath Anna's baby clothes, which she had been unable to bear parting with, was a disassembled military-grade rifle. It was a custom-built weapon that Pavel had given her as an anniversary gift, perfectly balanced for her smaller frame, and modified for enhanced accuracy at long ranges. She had not touched the weapon since arriving in Brentfield, knowing that possessing it would mean certain death if discovered. But as she ran her fingers along the familiar metal surfaces, muscle memory flooded back. Her hands automatically began the process of field stripping and inspecting the weapon, checking for any signs of moisture damage or corrosion that might affect its performance. The rifle was in perfect condition, maintained by the oil and careful wrapping that had protected it during their months in hiding. Katerina reassembled the weapon quickly but did not load it. Instead, she wrapped it again and returned it to its hiding place. She was not yet ready to transition from passive observation to active resistance, but she wanted to be prepared if circumstances forced her hand. As the morning progressed, the normal sounds of village life gradually faded into an unnatural quiet. Dogs stopped barking, children were called inside by worried parents, and the usual bustle of activity around the central well ceased entirely. Katerina recognized these signs from her military experience. The way civilian populations instinctively sensed approaching danger and sought shelter. Through her kitchen window, she could see movement along the road that connected Brentfield to Millbrook. Military vehicles were approaching, more than she had ever seen during routine patrols. The convoy consisted of at least 6 trucks and 2 armored personnel carriers, suggesting that whatever operation was planned would involve a significant number of soldiers. Mrs. Petrova joined her at the window, both women watching as the convoy entered the village and began deploying troops at strategic locations. Soldiers took positions around the central square, while others began moving from house to house in a systematic search pattern. "This is not a routine patrol," Katerina observed quietly. Mrs. Petrova nodded grimly. "They're looking for someone important. Someone they think might be hiding here." As they watched, Katerina began mentally cataloging the number and positioning of enemy forces. Her military training made such assessments automatic, even in situations where she had no intention of engaging in combat. She counted approximately 40 soldiers, armed with standard assault rifles and supported by 2 heavy machine gun positions. The officer directing operations appeared to be Lieutenant Colonel Steinman himself, recognizable from previous encounters during village inspections. The search progressed methodically through the village, with soldiers spending considerable time at each house. Katerina could hear the sounds of furniture being moved, belongings scattered, and voices raised in fear or protest from civilian residents. Several people were led away in restraints, though she could not determine whether they were being arrested or simply taken for questioning. As the soldiers worked their way closer to her cottage, Katerina made a final decision. She moved to the kitchen table and began kneading bread dough, a task that would give her an excuse to keep her hands busy and avoid meeting the eyes of any soldiers who entered. She wanted to appear completely absorbed in domestic activities, presenting the image of a woman so focused on basic survival needs that she posed no possible threat to military operations. The sound of heavy boots on the cottage's front porch announced the arrival of the search team. Mrs. Petrova moved slowly toward the door, playing up her age and frailty, while Katerina continued working the bread dough with steady, unhurried movements. When the door burst open without warning, revealing 3 soldiers with weapons raised, Katerina didn't even look up from her work. She had trained herself to control every physical response, every micro-expression that might betray her true nature. Her hands continued their rhythmic kneading, her breathing remained steady and calm, and her facial expression showed nothing more than the mild anxiety appropriate for a frightened civilian. "Papers," demanded the sergeant leading the search team, speaking in the local language with a heavy accent. Mrs. Petrova produced the identity documents for all 3 residents of the cottage, including Anna's papers even though the child was not present. Katerina finally looked up from her bread-making, offering a hesitant, fearful smile that perfectly matched her assumed identity as a traumatized refugee. The sergeant studied the documents carefully, comparing the photographs to the women in front of him. Katerina had been careful to alter her appearance since arriving in Brenfield, allowing her hair to grow longer and lose the precise military styling she had once maintained. She had also lost weight due to the limited food rations, which changed the shape of her face enough to make identification more difficult. Katerina Volkov, the sergeant read from her papers, previously resided in the capital. Occupation listed as seamstress. "Yes, sir." Katerina replied quietly, keeping her voice soft and submissive. "I worked in a clothing factory before the troubles." "What kind of work did you do at this factory?" "Hemming and button attachment, sir." "Simple work. Nothing important." It was technically true, though it represented only a fraction of her actual work experience. During her military service, she had indeed worked part-time at a clothing factory as part of her cover identity for certain operations. The mundane nature of the job had made it perfect for maintaining her civilian credentials while serving in the sniper program. While the sergeant questioned her, the other 2 soldiers began searching the cottage systematically. They overturned furniture, emptied drawers, and examined every space where weapons or contraband might be hidden. Katerina forced herself to watch this destruction of her temporary home with the appropriate level of distress, allowing tears to form in her eyes as they scattered Anna's few toys and Mrs. Petrova's precious photographs. One of the soldiers discovered the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Katerina's heart rate increased, but she kept her breathing steady as she watched him pull out the leather journal and the bundle containing Anna's baby clothes. He flipped through the journal quickly, seeing only what appeared to be notes about gardening and household management. "Just refugee junk," he announced, tossing the journal back into the compartment without careful examination. He didn't unwrap the bundle of baby clothes, dismissing it as sentimental items of no tactical value. The search continued for another 20 minutes, during which the soldiers found nothing to suggest that the cottage's residents were anything other than what they appeared to be. Katerina maintained her bread-making activity throughout the entire process, periodically glancing up with worried eyes, but never showing any behavior that might suggest she was anything other than a frightened civilian. Finally, the sergeant completed his inspection of their identity papers and handed them back to Mrs. Petrova. "You will report any suspicious activity to the command post immediately," he told them. "Anyone found harboring resistance fighters or weapons will be executed." "Of course, sir." Petrova replied with appropriate deference. "We are loyal citizens. We want only peace." As the soldiers prepared to leave, the sergeant took one final look at Katerina. For a moment she felt his gaze examining her face, her posture, her hands still working the bread dough. Then he turned away, apparently satisfied that she posed no threat to military operations. After the soldiers left, Katerina and Mrs. Petrova remained in position for several minutes, listening as the search team moved on to the next house. Only when the sounds of boots and harsh voices had faded did they allow themselves to relax slightly. "That was closer than I would have liked," Mrs. Petrova observed quietly. Katerina nodded,
finally setting aside the bread dough that had served as her prop during the search. Her hands were trembling slightly now, a delayed reaction to the stress of maintaining her performance while armed soldiers examined every aspect of their living space.
But as she watched the military convoy eventually withdraw from the village, taking with them several arrested residents, Katerina felt something shifting inside her. The passive phase of her resistance was coming to an end. The occupying forces were becoming more aggressive, more thorough in their searches, and more suspicious of the civilian population. It was only a matter of time before someone connected her current identity to her military background. She thought about Anna, safely hidden away at Mrs. Martinez's house, and about the other children in Brentfield who lived in daily fear of the soldiers.
She thought about Tom Brennan and the other innocent people who had been taken away for questioning and never returned. Most of all, she thought about Pavel and the oath they had both taken to protect their people from foreign invasion.
The quiet woman that Lieutenant Colonel Steinman and his soldiers had dismissed as harmless was about to remind them why underestimating an opponent could be a fatal mistake. 3 days after the intensive search operation, Katerina made a discovery that changed everything. She had been walking to the village well early in the morning when she noticed fresh tire tracks leading into the forest behind the old church. The tracks were deep and wide, suggesting heavy military vehicles, but they led away from the established patrol routes that she had been carefully mapping for months. Her curiosity aroused, she followed the tracks for nearly a kilometer until she reached a clearing that had been invisible from any of the village roads. What she found there made her blood run cold. The occupying forces had constructed a temporary detention facility, complete with prefabricated holding cells, interrogation rooms, and what appeared to be execution posts. Fresh graves dotted the perimeter of the compound, marked only by wooden stakes driven into the disturbed earth. Katerina counted at least 15 prisoners in the outdoor holding area, including several faces she recognized from Brenfield and neighboring communities. Tom Brennan was among them, barely recognizable after days of brutal questioning. His face was swollen and discolored, and he moved with the careful, pained motions of someone suffering from broken ribs or other internal injuries. From her concealed position in the dense undergrowth, she observed the compound for over an hour, noting guard positions, shift changes, and security protocols. The facility was designed for efficiency rather than long-term operation, suggesting that the occupying forces intended to process prisoners quickly before moving on to other targets. The implications were chilling. These were not prisoners of war who would eventually be exchanged or relocated to formal detention centers. These were civilians marked for elimination. She also noticed something else that filled her with both hope and dread. In the administrative area of the compound, she could see maps and documents spread across several tables. Even at a distance, she recognized the geographical features depicted on those maps. The enemy was planning operations throughout the entire region, operations that would affect thousands of innocent people living in small communities like Brenfield. As she made her way back to the village, moving carefully to avoid detection, Katerina's mind raced through possible courses of action. The information she had gathered was invaluable, but she had no way to communicate it to friendly forces. The resistance network in their area had been largely dismantled during the initial occupation, and she had no reliable contacts who could relay intelligence to military units still fighting in other regions. She also faced a more immediate problem. The detention facility represented a clear and present threat to everyone in Brenfield. If the pattern she had observed held true, more residents would be arrested over the coming days and taken to that clearing in the forest. Once there, they would face interrogation, torture, and almost certain execution. The strategic part of her mind understood that rescuing the current prisoners would be extremely difficult and would almost certainly expose her true identity. The compound was well guarded and situated in terrain that offered little cover for approach or escape. Any rescue attempt would require careful planning, adequate weapons, and probably additional personnel that she simply didn't have. But the human part of her mind, the part that remembered Tom Brennan's kindness when she and Anna had first arrived in the village, couldn't accept abandoning innocent people to such a fate. These were her neighbors, people who had shared their meager resources with refugees, who had welcomed strangers into their community despite their own hardships. Over the next 2 days, Katerina began developing a plan that balanced tactical necessity with moral obligation. She couldn't rescue all the prisoners, but she might be able to create enough disruption to save some lives while gathering additional intelligence about enemy operations. The key would be timing and precision, using her specialized skills to maximum advantage while minimizing exposure to enemy retaliation. She started by conducting detailed reconnaissance of the area surrounding the detention facility.
During her supposed foraging trips to gather edible plants and herbs, she mapped every trail, every rock formation, every tree that might provide cover or concealment. She identified 3 potential sniper positions that would give her clear lines of sight to key areas of the compound, while offering multiple escape routes. The most promising position was an outcropping of granite boulders approximately 800 meters northeast of the detention facility. The rocks provided excellent concealment and a stable shooting platform, while the dense forest behind them offered multiple paths for withdrawal. The distance was well within her effective range, and the elevated position would allow her to observe the entire compound layout. From the second position, located in a tall pine tree roughly 600 meters to the east, she would have a different angle of approach and could cover the main access road to the compound. This position would be riskier, as it offered fewer escape options, but it would be perfect for disrupting any attempt to bring in reinforcements. The third position was closer to the compound, only 400 meters to the south, hidden in a ravine carved by a seasonal stream. This location would be ideal for precision work requiring absolute accuracy, but it would also be the most dangerous in terms of enemy response and withdrawal. As she refined her tactical assessment, Katerina also began preparing her equipment. She retrieved the disassembled rifle from its hiding place and conducted a complete inspection of every component. The weapon had been stored properly and showed no signs of deterioration, but she wanted to ensure absolute reliability before committing to any action. She also inventoried her ammunition supply. Pavel had managed to pack 24 rounds of match-grade ammunition when they fled the capital, each cartridge carefully selected for optimal performance in her rifle. 24 shots represented 24 opportunities to make a difference, but it also meant she would need to make every shot count. There would be no margin for error, no opportunity for suppressive fire or warning shots. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more challenging than the tactical planning. For months, Katerina had suppressed her warrior instincts, forcing herself to think and act like a victim rather than a soldier. Now she needed to access those deeply buried skills while maintaining the emotional control necessary for precision shooting under combat conditions. She began each morning with meditation exercises she had learned during sniper training, techniques designed to slow her heart rate and steady her breathing. She practiced the mental routines that would allow her to calculate range, wind compensation, and target priority under stress. Most importantly, she rehearsed the psychological transition from observer to active combatant, preparing herself to take lives in defense of innocent people. On the 4th day after discovering the detention facility, Katerina's preparations were interrupted by devastating news. Anna returned from her daily visit to Mrs. Martinez with tears streaming down her face and terror in her dark eyes. "Mama," she whispered, clinging to Katerina's legs, as if she could hide from the world's cruelty in her mother's embrace. The soldiers took Mrs. Chen, and Mr. Davidov, and the baker's wife. They're saying terrible things will happen to anyone who helps the resistance. Katerina felt her carefully controlled composure crack. Chen had been one of their closest neighbors, a gentlewoman who had shared vegetables from her garden and helped watch Anna when necessary. Mr. Davidov was the village blacksmith, a man whose greatest crime was complaining about the quality of horseshoe nails rationed by the occupation forces. The baker's wife was pregnant with her 3rd child. "Are they taking them to the same place as the others?" Katerina asked, though she already knew the answer. Anna nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Mrs. Martinez says they're loading them into trucks tonight. She says we should pray for their souls because they won't be coming back." That evening, as darkness settled over Brentfield like a burial shroud, Katerina made her final decision. She could no longer remain passive while innocent people were murdered. Her oath as a soldier, her duty as a citizen, and her love for her community all demanded action. She waited until Anna and Mrs. Petrova were asleep, then quietly retrieved her rifle and ammunition from their hiding place. She assembled the weapon by touch in the darkened cottage, muscle memory guiding her hands through the familiar process. The metal felt cold and reassuring under her fingers, a tangible connection to her true identity and capabilities. Before leaving the cottage, she wrote a brief letter explaining her actions and asking Mrs. Petrova to care for Anna if she did not return. She sealed the letter and placed it where it would be found easily, but only if something happened to prevent her from destroying it upon her return. The walk to her chosen firing position took 45 minutes through forest paths she had memorized during her reconnaissance missions. She moved with the absolute silence that had made her legendary among her military unit, placing each footstep with deliberate care, avoiding even the smallest twig or rustling leaf that might betray her presence. The granite outcropping provided exactly the concealment and stability she had anticipated. From her position among the boulders, she had a commanding view of the entire detention compound, now illuminated by harsh electric lights powered by portable generators. The guards moved in predictable patterns, and she could see prisoners huddled in the outdoor holding area,
including the newest arrivals from Brenfield. Through her rifle scope she could make out individual faces among the prisoners. Mrs. Chen sat with her back against the chain-link fence, her normally neat hair disheveled and her clothing torn. Mr. Davidoff appeared to be injured, holding one arm awkwardly against his body. The baker's pregnant wife lay on the ground, and Katerina couldn't tell from this distance whether she was unconscious or simply exhausted. She also observed the enemy personnel more closely than had been possible during her earlier reconnaissance. The compound was staffed by approximately 15 soldiers, under the command of a captain she didn't recognize. Their weapons and equipment appeared to be standard issue, but their discipline and alertness suggested they were experienced combat troops rather than rear-area security personnel. Most importantly, she identified the key targets whose elimination would create maximum disruption of enemy operations. The captain was obvious, but she also noted the communications operator who maintained contact with higher headquarters, the senior sergeant who coordinated guard details, and the soldier responsible for operating the portable generator that powered the compound's lights and security systems. Katerina settled into her shooting position and began the methodical process of range estimation and environmental assessment. The distance to the compound was exactly 847 meters, well within her effective range but requiring careful calculation of bullet trajectory. The wind was light and steady from the northwest, which would require minimal compensation. Temperature and humidity were within normal parameters for her ammunition's ballistic characteristics. She spent nearly an hour observing the compound's routine, timing guard movements, and identifying the optimal sequence of targets. Her first shot would need to eliminate the communications operator before he could report the attack to higher headquarters. Her second shot would target the generator operator, plunging the compound into darkness and creating confusion among the remaining guards. Subsequent shots would focus on the command personnel and anyone attempting to organize a coherent response. As midnight approached, Katerina noticed increased activity in the administrative area of the compound. Several soldiers emerged from what appeared to be the command tent, and she could see papers being shuffled and equipment being prepared. Through her scope, she observed Lieutenant Colonel Steinman himself arriving at the compound in an armored staff car. The presence of such a senior officer suggested that something significant was about to occur, possibly the execution of prisoners, or the launch of a new operation against nearby communities. Either possibility reinforced her decision to act immediately rather than waiting for better conditions. She aligned her rifle on the communications operator, a young soldier who sat at a field radio approximately 200 meters from the nearest prisoners. The shot would need to be precise as the soldier was partially concealed behind equipment cases and the angle was challenging. But Katerina had made more difficult shots under worse conditions. As she prepared to squeeze the trigger, taking up the slack and beginning the controlled breathing pattern that would steady her aim, she thought about Pavel and the conversation they had shared on their wedding night 7 years earlier. They had talked about the sacrifices that military service might require, the possibility that duty might demand actions that would fundamentally change who they were as people. Sometimes, Pavel had said, holding her in their small apartment overlooking the city they both loved, we have to become dangerous so that good people can remain safe. Now, in the darkness of the forest with innocent lives hanging in the balance, Katerina understood the full meaning of those words. She was about to cross a line that would transform her from a hidden refugee into an active combatant, a change that would affect not only her own fate but Anna's future as well. But as she watched Mrs. Chen's shoulders shake with quiet sobs and saw the baker's pregnant wife struggling to sit up despite her obvious pain, Katerina knew that some lines were worth crossing. She steadied her breathing, confirmed her sight picture one final time, and began the smooth, controlled trigger pull that would announce to Lieutenant Colonel Steinman and his forces that their quiet occupation of the region was about to become significantly more complicated. The suppressed rifle whispered its deadly message across the dark forest and the communications operator collapsed without a sound. Before his body had finished falling, Katerina was already acquiring her second target, her movements fluid and automatic as years of training took control of her actions. The war had finally come to Brenfield, and it had arrived in the form of a woman they had dismissed as harmless. The second shot eliminated the generator operator before he could process what had happened to his colleague. The compound's electric lights died instantly, plunging the detention facility into darkness broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. In that moment of sudden blackness, Katerina heard the first shouts of alarm from the guards, their voices sharp with confusion, and the beginning edge of fear. She had anticipated this moment of chaos and was already shifting her aim toward the command tent where Lieutenant Colonel Steinman had established his temporary headquarters. Through her night vision scope she could see figures moving frantically inside the illuminated tent, silhouetted against the canvas walls by battery-powered lanterns. Steinman himself was clearly visible, his distinctive profile unmistakable as he barked orders at subordinates who were struggling to understand what was happening. Her third shot took down the senior sergeant who emerged from the tent carrying what appeared to be emergency communication equipment. The man dropped instantly, and the radio he had been carrying shattered against the rocky ground. With their primary communications severed and their backup equipment destroyed, the compound was effectively isolated from outside support. The remaining guards were beginning to organize a response, but their movements showed the uncertainty of soldiers facing an unknown threat from an unknown direction. Some took defensive positions around the prisoner holding area, while others attempted to establish a perimeter around the command facilities. Their flashlights and emergency lanterns created perfect targets for someone with night vision capability and precision marksmanship skills. Katerina's fourth shot extinguished one of the emergency lanterns and sent the soldier carrying it diving for cover behind a supply tent. Her fifth shot eliminated a guard who was attempting to use a spotlight to scan the tree line. Each shot created more confusion and fear among the enemy forces, disrupting their ability to mount an organized response. From her concealed position, she could hear Lieutenant Colonel Steinman shouting orders, his voice carrying across the compound with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. But his commands were being executed by increasingly panicked soldiers, who had no clear understanding of what they were facing. Some were firing randomly into the forest, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions while accomplishing nothing except wasting ammunition. Katerina used these muzzle flashes to identify additional targets. Her sixth shot silenced a soldier who had been firing an automatic rifle in the general direction of her position, though his shots were landing at least 200 meters wide of her actual location. Her seventh shot took down another guard who was attempting to use a field telephone, ensuring that no word of the attack could reach higher headquarters through any remaining communication channels. As the firefight continued, she noticed movement in the prisoner holding area. Several of the detainees had realized that the darkness and confusion provided an opportunity for escape. She watched through her scope as shadowy figures began cutting through the chain-link fence using makeshift tools, working frantically while the guards' attention was focused on locating the source of sniper fire. Mrs. Chen was among the escaping prisoners, helping the injured baker's wife move through a gap in the fence while Mr. Davidov, despite his injured arm, assisted other detainees in their flight toward the forest. Tom Brennan, moving with obvious pain from his injuries, was helping to organize the evacuation and ensure that weaker prisoners weren't left behind. Katerina shifted her fire to support the escape effort, targeting guards who moved too close to the prisoner area or who seemed to be regaining their composure. Her eighth shot eliminated a soldier who had noticed the prison break and was raising his rifle toward the fleeing civilians. Her ninth shot took down another guard who was attempting to pursue the escaped prisoners into the forest. But she also realized that her position was becoming increasingly precarious. The enemy forces were beginning to triangulate the source of her fire, and several soldiers were moving through the forest in her general direction. More concerning, she could see Lieutenant Colonel Steinman coordinating a more systematic response, deploying his remaining troops in a pattern that would eventually locate and surround her position. She had planned for this possibility and began implementing her withdrawal strategy. After her 10th shot, which eliminated another soldier attempting to establish communications with headquarters, she quickly disassembled her rifle into its component parts and secured them in a specially designed backpack that would allow her to move rapidly through the forest. The withdrawal from her firing position required all the stealth and woodcraft skills she had developed during her military training. She moved in a wide arc around the detention compound, staying well clear of the search teams that were combing the forest with increasing organization and determination. The sound of pursuit gradually faded as she put distance between herself and the site of her attack. But Katerina knew that her actions had fundamentally changed the situation in Brenfield and the surrounding region. The attack on the detention facility would provoke massive retaliation from the occupying forces. Lieutenant Colonel Steinman would not accept such a direct challenge to his authority without responding with overwhelming force. Every civilian in the area would be viewed as a potential threat, and the relatively restrained occupation policies of the past months would be replaced by harsh martial law. She reached the cottage as dawn was breaking over the village, her clothes torn from passage through dense undergrowth, and her hands scratched by thorns and branches. Anna was still sleeping, but Mrs. Petrova was awake and waiting in the kitchen, her weathered face showing a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I heard shooting in the forest," the elderly woman said quietly. "And I found your letter." Katerina nodded, retrieving the letter she had written and burning it in the fireplace. "Some of our neighbors have been freed, but things are going to get much worse before they get better." Mrs. Petrova studied her with the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived multiple occupations and understood the terrible mathematics of resistance and retaliation. "How many did you kill?" 10 confirmed. "Possibly more wounded who will die later." "And Steinman?"
still alive. I had opportunities to eliminate him, but his death would have brought even more brutal retaliation against civilians.
Better to let him live with the knowledge that his forces are vulnerable. Over the following hours, the results of her nighttime operation became apparent throughout the village.
Tom Brennan appeared at their door just after noon, moving carefully but alive and free. His face still bore the marks of brutal questioning, but his eyes showed the fierce determination of someone who had survived the worst his enemies could inflict.
11 prisoners escaped because of what you did, he told Katerina, his voice hoarse from injuries to his throat. Mrs. Chen and the others made it safely to the resistance network in the eastern mountains. They're spreading word about the detention facility and the execution orders. But Tom also brought disturbing news about the enemy response. Steinman has declared martial law throughout the entire region. Anyone found outside their homes after sunset will be shot on sight. He's bringing in additional troops from the capital, including specialized counterinsurgency units trained to hunt resistance fighters. Katerina had expected such a response, but the reality was still sobering. Her actions had bought freedom for 11 innocent people and disrupted enemy operations, but they had also escalated the conflict to a level that would bring suffering to many more civilians. The escalation became apparent that very afternoon when military convoys began arriving in Brentfield. Instead of the routine patrols the village had endured for months, these were combat units equipped for sustained operations against guerrilla forces. They established checkpoints at every road leading in and out of the village, conducted house-to-house searches with unprecedented thoroughness, and imposed restrictions on civilian movement that turned the community into an open-air prison. Lieutenant Colonel Steinman personally supervised the search of Katerina's cottage, arriving with a full squad of soldiers and spending over an hour examining every inch of their living space. This time, the search was far more professional and systematic than the previous operation. They found the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and confiscated the leather journal. Though Katerina had been careful to remove the most incriminating pages during her earlier preparations, Steinman himself interrogated each resident of the cottage, his pale eyes studying their faces with the intensity of someone searching for the smallest sign of deception. When he questioned Katerina, she maintained the same submissive demeanor she had displayed during previous encounters, but she could sense his heightened suspicion. "You seem remarkably calm for someone living through such dangerous times," he observed, his accented English precise and cold. "I have learned that worry changes nothing, sir," Katerina replied quietly. "My daughter and I survive by avoiding trouble and keeping to ourselves." "Yes, your daughter. Where is she now?" "Helping Mrs. Martinez with her household work, sir."
Children need tasks to keep them busy during difficult times. Steinman made notes in a small leather notebook, recording details about their answers and behavior.
Katerina realized that he was building comprehensive files on every resident, looking for patterns and inconsistencies that might reveal hidden resistance sympathies. Over the next week, the intensity of the occupation increased dramatically. The new troops conducted daily patrols through the village, searching randomly selected houses and interrogating residents about any unusual activities they might have observed. A reward was posted for information leading to the identification of the sniper who had attacked the detention facility, an amount large enough to tempt even loyal neighbors. But the harsh measures also had an unintended effect. Instead of intimidating the civilian population into complete submission, the increased oppression began generating genuine resistance sentiment among people who had previously accepted the occupation passively. Conversations that had once focused on survival and accommodation now included whispered discussions about fighting back. Katerina found herself becoming an unofficial leader of this emerging resistance network, though she was careful to maintain her public persona as a frightened refugee. During seemingly innocent conversations at the village well or while gathering firewood, she shared tactical knowledge that helped other residents avoid detection during searches and evade the new movement restrictions. She also began training select individuals in basic reconnaissance and communication techniques, preparing them to serve as an intelligence network that could monitor enemy activities and provide early warning of planned operations. Martinez proved particularly adept at observing patrol schedules and identifying changes in enemy routine. The baker, whose wife had been among the rescued prisoners, volunteered to serve as a courier between Brentfield and resistance cells in neighboring communities. But Katerina knew that these nascent resistance activities would eventually be discovered. Lieutenant Colonel Steinman was too experienced and too thorough to overlook the signs of organized opposition indefinitely. She began developing contingency plans for protecting Anna and the other civilians when the inevitable crackdown occurred. The crisis came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after her attack on the detention facility, Katerina noticed unusual activity around the command post that had been established in the village center. Additional officers had arrived, including specialists she recognized as counterintelligence personnel. Their presence suggested that enemy investigators were close to identifying her as the sniper responsible for the prison break. That evening, as she tucked Anna into bed, Katerina made the most difficult decision of her life. She had to leave Brentfield immediately, both to protect her daughter and to prevent retaliation against the entire community. But she also knew that her departure would effectively end the local resistance network before it could mature into an effective fighting force. "Anna, my little bird, I need to tell you something very important," she whispered, stroking her daughter's dark hair. "Tomorrow, you're going to go live with Mrs.
Martinez for a while. I have to go away on a journey." Anna's eyes widened with fear and understanding beyond her years. "Are you going to find Papa?"
The question pierced Katerina's heart, but she maintained her composure for her daughter's sake.
"I'm going to try to help make things better so that children like you can be safe. Mrs. Martinez will take good care of you, and I'll come back as soon as I can. Are you going to keep fighting the bad men?" Katerina paused, considering how to answer honestly without frightening the child further.
"Sometimes, little bird, people have to be brave in ways that keep them away from the ones they love. But everything I do will be to make a world where you can grow up without being afraid."
The next morning, Katerina began her final preparations for departure. She disassembled her rifle one last time and distributed the components among several different hiding places throughout the village, where they could be retrieved by other resistance fighters if needed. She prepared detailed maps and intelligence summaries for the emerging network, providing them with the tactical knowledge they would need to continue operations in her absence. Most importantly, she made arrangements for Anna's long-term care and protection. Mrs. Martinez had agreed to present Anna as her own grandniece, a story that would be supported by forged documents prepared by the Baker's network of contacts in other villages. Anna would have a new identity that concealed her connection to Katerina, protecting her from retaliation should her mother's true identity be discovered. As afternoon faded into evening, Katerina prepared to leave the cottage that had sheltered them for so many months. She packed light, carrying only essential supplies and equipment for sustained operations in the wilderness. The leather journal, now containing detailed intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities throughout the region, was secured in a waterproof pouch along with maps and communication codes. But before departing, she had one final task to complete. Moving through the forest with the same stealth that had served her during the detention facility raid, she approached the new command post that Lieutenant Colonel Steinman had established in the village center. From a concealed position, she observed the heavily guarded compound where her enemies were planning their next operations against civilian populations. Through her scope, she could see Steinman himself working late in his command tent, studying maps and documents by the light of battery-powered lanterns. For a moment, she considered ending his threat permanently with a single precisely placed shot. The range was extreme for such a difficult target, but she had made more challenging shots during her military career. But she ultimately decided against assassination, recognizing that Steinman's death would bring massive retaliation against every civilian in Brentfield. Instead, she aimed for a target that would deliver a different kind of message. Her shot shattered the lantern on Steinman's field desk, plunging his command tent into darkness and sending him diving for cover. As emergency lights flickered on and guards scrambled to locate the source of the shot, Katerina was already melting back into the forest. But she had accomplished her objective. Steinman now knew that despite all his security measures and counterintelligence operations, his enemies could reach him at any time and in any place. The message was clear. The quiet woman he had dismissed as harmless was still watching, still fighting, and still capable of striking when he least expected it. As she disappeared into the darkness, moving toward the mountains where other resistance fighters waited, Katerina carried with her the knowledge that her actions had fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. The enemy's assumption of invulnerability had been shattered, civilian resistance was spreading throughout the region, and the cost of occupation was escalating beyond what the enemy command had anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Steinman would spend the remainder of his deployment looking over his shoulder, knowing that somewhere in the forests and villages under his control, a ghost-like adversary was planning her next move. The woman they had fought defeated by trauma and loss had instead been forged into a weapon more dangerous than anything they had faced before. In the months that followed, reports would reach the village of a female sniper operating throughout the region, disrupting enemy supply lines, eliminating key personnel, and inspiring other resistance cells to escalate their activities. The occupying forces would eventually withdraw from the area, citing unsustainable casualties and the impossibility of maintaining control over a hostile civilian population. But that victory lay in the future. For now, Katerina moved through the mountain darkness, carrying her rifle, her memories, and her unbreakable commitment to the people she had left behind. The quiet woman was quiet no longer.
and her silence had been transformed into a weapon that would echo through enemy nightmares for years to come. Anna would grow up in safety under Mrs.
Martinez's protection, never knowing the full extent of her mother's actions but carrying within her the strength and determination that had made those actions possible. And someday, when peace returned to their homeland, mother and daughter would be reunited in a world made safer by a woman who refused to let silence be mistaken for surrender.
The war was far from over, but the enemy had learned a crucial lesson about the dangers of underestimating those they sought to oppress. In the end, the greatest victories are often won, not by those who shout loudest, but by those who choose their moments to break their silence with the devastating precision.